So thank you all for coming. Also, thank you, Cambridge Reproduction, for hosting online and always handling all of the technical aspects of how to make this happen and how to put the right people in the right place to answer these questions. I've been working with Christina since my first year here, and it was great to have that online community when even our testing team was quite fragmented in starting the study, just to kind of get my head around Cambridge and kind of work people through and kind of welcome me to the Institute, and also get a sense of the history of reproduction at Cambridge, which I knew coming in, but to actually be part of it is amazing. I'm a postdoc. I was a sonographer, and now we're about 60 participants into collecting what would be a large longitudinal study with many measures. And today I'll just focus on the ultrasound and the NVAS measures, but there's other people in this room looking at you, or even if you're not looking at me, who have collected loads and loads of neuroimaging data using NIRS, which is the cat that's pictured in newborns, also taught and online, and others are part of analyzing and developing these tools to study the newborn brain at home. So we go to families. I'll describe the project in detail. But just to say that I'm part of a much bigger group, and this is just a small section of the data that we are looking at. So I think Nadia started off nicely by getting into the debate of, do babies do anything in the womb? Does it matter? But the answer I like to think is it does matter. And hopefully she started to convince you of that. But the question is, what do they do? What kinds of different things do they do? It's a busy slide, but I think this is just showing you the range of different kind of activities. This baby, I don't know if you've actually got my, this, you don't really have my cursor on there, but you can see that the bottom row has a baby that looks like they're sleeping, and then suddenly they jerk and move away. And the first baby in the bottom row is actually probably asleep. So again, these sleep states matter, these wake states matter, and they change quite often in this course of scans, which we do at the Rosie Hospital, working with sonographers there. And just kind of think it's interesting to point out the range of behaviors and abilities of the fetus, because I don't think many people know it, and even parents who come in knowing what we study are pretty amazed by how much they can see over the course of a long time. Now, a lot of times it takes a while to get the right picture, and the first pictures that we see look a bit like this one that's in the lower right corner, which is, I just call a bit ghosty, but after a few minutes, usually you get used to the range of movement of the fetus, you get the fetus and the mother in the right position, and we're able to get these quite good 4D scans once there's sufficient amniotic fluid. But beyond what babies can do in the womb, I think the kind of research question embedded in that is, do these differences between individuals occur early, and are they meaningful, is kind of the next set of questions. And in addition to that, do they have any effect in the long term on children's development? Do they kind of give us a window into what positions a baby might be comfortable in, what kind of babies use some of these strategies we even see in the womb postnatally to comfort themselves, and how does that affect their brain development, their behavior, and their motor development as they age? And this is actually one baby in the study, for what it's worth, if you can't tell. So this is the full scope of the Perinatal Imaging Partnership with families, which is very much ongoing, at least until next year. This is just the range of measures that we use, but at 32 weeks, we do 4D ultrasound as well as questionnaires. And again, later we do the same thing. And we're particularly looking at development in the 3rd trimester with the interest of babies go through particular autonomic challenges and changes in this time period that's associated with kind of they're developing their own cortisol and other autonomic systems that, rather than being tuned by exposure to the mother through the placenta, kind of after months of exposure to the mother's normative levels, the infant starts kind of its own autonomic system. So we're particularly interested in these changes. And we also see really important changes that are not just linear. So it's not as if with time there's more movement. In some cases, we actually see that there's less movement during the third trimester as babies get older, partially because they have less room and partially because they spend a lot more of their time resting. So I'm really interested in not just this notion of development being linear, forward-based, but also these periods of regression and change that we see that are associated with important and, genuine positive steps in development, normative steps in development that are not just increasing with time. More movement is not necessarily better. It's just more data. That's kind of my perspective. So then we also go to families' homes for 3 visits within the first month of a baby's life. So I'll show a little bit more about what we do on those visits in the next few slides. But we go when babies are under 10 days, from 10 to 20 days, and again around 1 month. And then we also drop off equipment that records what the baby sees, what their home environment is like at 3 months. And then at 5 months, we finally bring babies in for what would be more familiar to typical developmental psychologists who study children, kind of a traditional set of lab visits using a range of tasks and measures in this kind of standardized setting, rather than the home environment, so that we have these outcome measures that are going to be comparable to other studies. So the main questions that I'm interested in are looking at potential insights from fetal kinematics and understanding if these differences across individuals that we see in our snapshots in the womb are meaningfully different across individuals, and if those individual differences are developmentally salient in the long term. So there's a lot of data and there's a lot of noise, but I think what I'm quite interested in is identifying a set of behaviors that might be adaptive in helping children's self-regulation and motor development long term. And I'll talk about what I've identified as kind of a potential precursor, but for what it's worth, we're coding every ounce of data that we get, including the kind of difficult to see moments. And finally, we're interested in identifying potential neurodevelopmental biomarkers that might link early prenatal motor activity to later neurodevelopmental outcomes, but especially just even typical differences in neurocognitive development and brain responses, such as to repeated stimuli and the ability to decrease attention to those stimuli habituation. And finally, we're interested in whether even in children who we might think have these differences that are meaningful, that are developmentally salient, that might have an implication that we can measure later in using neurodevelopmental biomarkers, including EEG and NIRS, whether these are malleable at a later stage or whether they're consistent across time, and how those differences relate to the infant and the family's social experience and stress. So I'm just going to address the first 2 research questions today, and this is still a very early stage of our data collection and analysis. So this is kind of ongoing work, but I'm interested in how we characterize the trajectory of motor development prenatally and how those individual differences might relate to other aspects of development, particularly motor development and self-regulation. Secondly, I'm interested in whether babies who are more effective at hand-to-mouth movements in the womb are also exhibiting this kind of behavior as newborns. So if there is signal, is there continuity of that signal across, massive dramatic disruptions of birth? And I'm also looking into newer methods that incorporate entropy or complexity to identify the fluidity and jerkiness of neonatal movements to understand how long-term smooth goal-directed actions that we are able to see in older infants develop at each stage from prenatal to postnatal. So just to say that we've been recruiting heavily from the Rosie, but also the community. And again, we're still actively recruiting. And this is kind of the public-facing aims of the project. And part of what we're looking at in partnership with Nadia is this first research question. And we look at the same kinds of questions using different but validated measures at different ages across time. So before babies are born, do they react differently when they're exposed to speech sounds repeatedly relative to other noises that might be more similar to what they hear in the womb? The gurgling of the mother's body, it kind of churns into something that resembles white noise, is what similar to people who study chemosensory processing. Someone has studied that and identified the exact frequency range of white noise that we think babies hear when they're still in the womb. We're also interested in how newborn babies learn, what's important, and how they learn to focus, not just on speech, but sounds, and distinguish them from objects. So again, these questions of social and non-social development that are very common in infant development, we're trying to take them down to the earliest biomarkers that we could get in newborns and potentially in the fetus as well. And finally, we're also interested in how parents, as this kind of first environment, not just in the womb, but also in their caregiving, create the conditions that let babies distinguish between human faces and voices and other stimuli in their environment. So this is an example of one of the tasks that we do with an intruder responding quite loudly and visibly to our stimuli. So this is the NBAS, which is a series of tasks that babies undergo that are set and structured. We do them in the home environment, come to the parents. Doing this lets us reach babies and families where they're at. So they come to usually the Rosie, which is their typical hospital for these ultrasound scans, early in their third trimester when they normally wouldn't get scans, which is a great opportunity and a great incentive, particularly as we're trying to look at a wider range of families than you might get in a traditional study in order to capture variation in home environments and in maternal environment, so to speak. So we are also capturing infants without some of the typical limitations of bringing them into the lab. We have more time. We're able to do these visits kind of as long as parents will let us. We capture the babies through many states of wakefulness and sleep, which is very important, not only for those interested in studying sleep, like Toppin and Borja, but also so that we can assess how babies respond and react and change across those states as well. We're also able, as a result, to record longer durations of this precious data. And yeah, can kind of see a little bit of the equipment and setup, which just comes in 2 large backpacks, and then we bring it to homes. And also, I'll kind of skip over this, but as a former allied healthcare worker myself, I just want to say that I think the recruitment and the setting of the Rosie provides us with a great alliance, an entry into families' lives and homes and healthcare system. And just want to encourage other people, when you can, to partner with healthcare workers. And they become kind of the parents' first resource, and your entry into their lives is facilitated by them. So I'll now talk a little bit about my research and approach. During my PhD, kind of developed this sonographer supervised method of, and the sonographer at this time was me, but now there's a range of sonographers who are trained in this method to identify different aspects of the fetal face and movements. And we use some existing tools like OpenPose and OpenCV, Open Computer Vision models that are used commonly. You know, it's how your phone identifies you and your cat and distinguishes different animals from one another and different people from one another. This is the same kind of technology that we're deploying and applying to fetal scans to identify what kinds of motion and what kinds of facial motion, facial features can be identified. So the way it basically works, just to be brief, is we put images that are not annotated by sonographers. This can be 2D or it could be 4D. You know, in principle, it works for both methods. One of the long-term goals might be, if these are useful in 4D, maybe they might be additionally supporting kind of 2D identification of very standard measures that are taken by sonographers that are important for health in the long term. But I've used them with both 2D and 4D images. And then we identify features of interest. They basically go into a matrix of zeros and ones, as you imagine. And the level of contrast between these pictures is what's of interest. We then create a map, which is probability-based, identifying, is this a nose? Is this a mouth? How close is it to the nasolabial fold? That's easy to identify to some degree in some pictures, in some moments. And how does this change frame by frame? So that's kind of this last step where we're using trackers to then apply these principles that are usually used for image detection to video detection. And actually what it ends up with is, because you've got some segments where things are quite visible and some segments where things are very hard to see, you actually end up getting more information than you would get if you just use this technology on a single image, because you can interpolate across those images. So it's a pixel-based method that lets us identify features in 3 dimensions, including volumetric. So it also takes into account the position of the probe and the position of the probe in the 2D image. So that this way we can generate kind of 3-dimensional models of how far is the hand from the point at the probe, which roughly maps onto kind of a 3D space. And then we go in and identify, it creates a probabilistic model that I then check against actual visual evidence to make sure that it's valid and that it's capturing it roughly frame by frame correctly. But these models are semi-automated, so it's mostly a label-fed model based on the contrast between the pixels. And this is my attempt at trying to explain what I think the computer vision model sees versus what we see. And just using these contrast features, it's able to make probabilistic guesses. And this is, exactly the same way the technology on your phone works. And that's slowly creeping into all of our lives in lots of different ways. Just a little warning. This is one more very intimate way it can creep into your life. Then we create models that are movement-based using the principles of kinematics, which basically track the speed and trajectory of motion with time, and identify each feature where it is in space and how it moves with time. There's also other methods that I'm exploring other than the kinematic kind of 3D-based methods. So this is a very popular, increasingly popular tool that's used to identify animals and other hard to work with data sets that are not easily applied to by existing kinematic models, which have massive amounts of people data in good lighting, and we know how human biomechanics work, but we don't know exactly how fetal biomechanics work, and it's harder to measure those in 3D in the same way. But using kind of 2D image labeling, where each point of interest is labeled, and I give my students and myself, I do this as well sometimes, a list of potential labels, and we go through together laboriously. This is Nadia's method, each frame by frame, and then try to identify what features are visible at any given time. And then the machine learning algorithm extrapolates from this labeled data set, again, semi-supervised approach, but this one is much more heavily supervised, meaning much more intense labeling frame by frame. But it basically is able to extrapolate where some of these coordinates are based on the data that's fed in. So just to say that this is kind of the basics of what model might look like. This is basically how much pixel diffusion, how much change there is frame by frame in where we expected the hand to be based on the last estimated position to the next estimated position with time. And this is our speech versus non-speech paradigm, and just one baby and one example of movement across those different conditions. When a baby is exposed to the speech syllable ma over and over, there's a reduction in hand and mouth movement. But when a new sound is introduced, which is PN, pink noise, what we think the womb sounds like, it seems like there's a jump or increase in activity. and that's because there's a wider difference, a big change in where the last estimate of the hand is and the current position of the hand. So just some early findings from using these methods is we're trying to look at questions about whether age of the baby, gestational age, family income, and maternal stress, how these influence the profile or smoothness and jerkiness of the movements that we see in the womb. So it seems like the best time to use this method, ideally, is from 31 to 33 weeks. After that point, we see less movement. So we're using across a wider range of time, but that's just to say that that doesn't mean everything that we're seeing is usable data. But a lot of it is, but we're able to get the longest segments when babies are 31 to 33 weeks. After that, it seems like there's a reduction in movements. This reduction is both an artifact and it's actually to some degree real, because it seems as if babies sleep for longer stretches and pregnancy advances. And also there's just less that we can see because there's less amniotic fluid and much more baby. That's when moms are starting to feel stretched. So that's just one of the limitations about doing some of the later scans, but sometimes we get great data. Our earliest finding is that from our existing sample, babies who were born to lower income families seem to exhibit higher entropy, meaning that they have more jerkiness in their movements. This jerkiness is associated with kind of less mature profile in general, and we generally think of those jerky movements as the first ones that we see in the first trimester. So if that same kind of movement is still characterizing a child's development, what we're trying to understand is how important is that, what is it associated with, and why? So it seems as if it's not just the resources of the family, but also maternal stress that's associated with these kind of responses. So in lower income families, babies who were born to lower stressor mothers, in fact, didn't show this effect as much. So it seems like it's more related to stress than it is family resources in the data that we have so far.
How did you measure stress?
Stress is through the perceived stress questionnaire.
Okay.
Yeah. It is one of the questions that we have. So that's all just through self-report to say out loud. Mm-hmm. And I'll just wrap up and briefly talk about how we're working to take these models that we're looking at to understand how the fetus changes from early in the third trimester to late in the third trimester, and apply them to infants in our sample using the home visit data. So we're intending to apply kinematics to this, but right now I've just analyzed observer-rated report of hand-to-mouth movements, which I think are going to be kind of developmentally salient. This is, I'm looking at a lot of data and I'm looking at the signal in the noise of infant movement and fetal movement and what's kind of common across them. So we're finding that speed of movements early on seem to predict their movements after they're born. And it seems like babies who are born and moving more rapidly in the third trimester are also more likely to show hand-to-mouth behavior as a consoling ability in the third trimester, after they're born in the first month of their life, from 1 week, 2 week, and 1 month data that we've collected from them, and that has been rated by an experimenter at home. So it seems like there's consistency and coupling of the hand-to-mouth movements, but that this is primarily driven by 1 to 10-day-old babies. So this effect actually is strongest right after babies are born. Interestingly, that's true for velocity, but it's not true for complexity of movements or entropy, which is another common measure. And we're starting to think from our existing data that long-term, this entropy measure, which also incorporates some of Nadia's coding scheme and includes more than just basic how fast is the hand moving to the mouth, but it includes the trajectory and the duration of time it took to travel that path from the hand approaching the mouth to the onset of when the hand has contacted the mouth. So just kind of quick findings is we're finding that speed and complexity are able to delineate different aspects of development. Particularly, it seems like speed, which is kind of this default measure of kinematic velocity, how fast is the hand moving, is useful specifically at predicting that same behavior postnatally. But when we're talking about salience or complexity and adding in, more measures than just sheer pixel ratios, we're able to identify long-term babies who might have differences in their hand-to-mouth movements as well as their motor maturity overall, as rated by an observer at 1 month and across the first 30 days of life. So that's kind of where we're at. And I think the next questions that this leads to are looking at kind of some of the later data, how well babies adjust to movement with time, and also how malleable some of these effects are to different ranges of social experience and stress exposure, both in the womb and in the months of life. So those will be our next research questions. And just want to give a big shout out to the very big team that's part of our study. That includes Nadia as a collaborator, but also lots of people online and in the room that make the study possible, as well as our amazing sonographers at the hospital, Julia, Sonia, and Ellen. And also wanted to thank the families. So this is an older daughter who drew a picture of what she thought she saw. And now this baby's probably 3 months almost. So yeah, it hasn't been that long since we've seen them. So yeah, I want to thank them for being part of the study, and Mark and Sarah for making the study in my time in Cambridge possible. Happy to take any questions.